Hello, everyone. I'm Sid Melcher. I'm Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Wilbraham and Munson Academy and Sir Speedy, and also, as always, a special thanks to NAI Plotkin, who provide us with this amazing space as well as an office here. I'd also like to thank our board member Jeremy Cole as well as Jeff Krasner, who are recording today's event. If you are not a member, we have these cards. We are a cheap date, so please join. In addition to getting benefits of membership, you're supporting an organization that promotes all kinds of good things. I've been telling a lot of you that, we were founded in 1926 after World War I, and a national effort to address xenophobia and isolationism in the American electorate. And as you know, we completely eliminated all of that. Highly successful. But we are doing our bit to encourage civil discourse on international events. So I hope you'll join us. This is our last Instant Issues event until the fall, but we do have another adventure in international dining coming up on June 4th at Formosa in Amherst, which will feature Taiwanese cuisine. The registration deadline is Sunday, June 1st. And I meant to have flyers here about that, but they're in my printer at home. So if you have any questions about it, you can come ask me, and we will get you signed up. Thank you to everyone who participated in our recent advocacy efforts for the State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program. We are still waiting for word on the future of IVLP, although it is still going on. But the response of members and friends has been heartwarming. We may have another round of advocacy efforts coming up, and we will keep you informed. Introducing our speaker today is Dawn Creighton, Community Outreach Coordinator at Liberty Bank, as well as a longtime member and friend of the World Affairs Council and former Vice President of our board. Take it away, Dawn.
Thank you so much, Sid. Wow, looks so different from up here. It really is a full house. Congratulations, Kristen. You really brought them out today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dawn Creighton. I'm the Community Outreach Officer for Liberty Bank. I've been with the bank for 2 years, and I love my role. But I do miss my days with Kristen when I worked with Kristen at AIM, Associated Industries of Massachusetts. I'm going off script. That's what I do, right, Sid? I used to work with Kristen, and Kristen was head of the International Business Council, and her responsibility was to engage the members of AIM with all things international, council generals and trade and all this fun stuff. Well, unbeknownst to everybody else, council generals love to come out to Western Mass. Nobody bothers to ask them. So I would go to a meeting with Kristen. She would introduce me to a council general. The next week I'd be run up, Sid, I met the council general from Ireland. Do you want him to come? Sid's like, yeah. So that's why we were able to get all the council generals. Everyone thinks that it's like this big, huge ordeal to get somebody out, but it's really not. Kristen can vouch for that. They love coming out here. One time we had the council general from the UK, and I had 20 minutes. I had no idea what to do with this person, none whatsoever. We were in between sessions, so I said, well, we should go to the marketplace across the hallway, when it was open in the hallway there, where behind like where Nosh was, for those of you that are locals. So we get there, and it's White Lion Wednesday. I looked like a rock star. Little did I know that the council general's husband was a beer connoisseur. And she thought I was surprising her and bringing her into something. That was just the best. So you can really look good very unexpectedly. That's Dawn's life lesson for the day. But back on script. Kristen is a longtime friend of the World Affairs Council. She served for nearly 20 years as the executive Director of Ames Business Council. Since 2024, she's been providing strategy consulting to nonprofit organizations. She has helped Massachusetts companies navigate international business challenges, including supply chain issues, tariffs, and new regulations. She assisted employers in their efforts to identify and enter new overseas markets. She produced a biweekly international newsletter, organized symposiums, conferences, and spoke on corporate panels, authorized op-eds and blogs, lectured universities, and served as advisory boards for the U.S. Chamber and the National Association of Manufacturers in Washington, D.C. Obviously, she's just, an underachiever, we all know. Kristen traveled through Massachusetts with the governors of Governor Patrick and Charlie Baker on trade missions in Europe. We were all very, very jealous every time she got to go on one of those trade missions. I one time tried to get into her suitcase, but she caught me. She's been to Europe, Central America, South America, the Mideast, Canada, and the Caribbean, and advocating for further international business relationships for companies in the Commonwealth. She will speak to us today on global trade turmoil, challenges, implications, opportunities. Please join me in a warm welcome to my good friend, Kristen Rupert.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. As Dawn said in her introduction, I'm Kristen Rupert. I worked at AIM for many years. I left about a year ago. When I was at AIM, I oversaw anything related to international business. And I'm fortunate that I've stayed in touch with a number of the people who are on a board that I ran within AIM, an international board, and other companies with which I worked, companies engaged with international business. So what I'm going to talk about a bit today is more big picture than specific to what's going on right here, but a lot of these big picture issues are relevant wherever you are, not just in Massachusetts, but really anywhere in the United States. Some of what I'm going to talk about today also is reflective of working through the COVID, the pandemic, and helping companies navigate that. And this isn't exactly the same, but there are some similarities. So how did companies get through that? What kind of advising did I do? What kind of information did they seek? And how did they manage through that process and mitigate the impact of the supply chain crisis at that time? One of the things that I've kept doing since I left AIM is staying up with what's going on in international business and trade. And I do this in a variety of ways, and I'll mention this at the end, but I would advise that if you're interested in this topic, there are a lot of great news sources to stay on top of. As you probably know, there's daily new information about what's going on with trade in the US. So I'm happy to share some of my sources. I think most of which are at no cost and some of which are at a little bit of cost. So it's beyond just the usual sources of information. I definitely don't have all the answers. I may have some answers, not sure. And I will say it was very difficult to prepare for this talk because if I'd started writing this talk a week ago, there would have been a lot of changes. So I obviously have some themes, and it may be very much the case that as we're speaking today, there could be something happening. So if you're looking at your phones, you'll let me know if there's been some new announcement of a change, of an increase in a tariff, the elimination of a tariff, some meeting that's set up or whatever. I'm also hoping that you'll all speak up about what you've heard or you're hearing or you're seeing or you're concerned about or what you've heard from others, because it's important during this time to get information, to share information. And I'll talk a little bit about at the end about what you can do, because it's easy to kind of feel like, I don't know what I can do. Actually, there is stuff you can do, and it's not complicated. So I'm going to cover that too. Okay, so here's the setup. The big word is uncertainty, and I'm sure that's not a surprise to anyone in this room. So in addition to the uncertainty thing, it's economic uncertainty and general uncertainty. I'm going to touch on tariffs. These are trends. Tariffs, protectionism/nationalism, supply chain challenges, small business struggles, a little bit about China and Canada, and some Massachusetts concerns. What I'm not going to talk much about, but what's important for you to know is everything that you've been hearing about trade has been focused on goods, not services. And it turns out that services exports from the US actually exceed in dollars goods exports. And services is tourism, higher education. So it's not a thing you can touch. It's not a good. Law, consulting, IT. So that's an important part of the equation when you look at international business. Most of the conversation today and most of the conversation in general is about exports and imports of goods, not services. But you just should know that. So first and foremost, economic uncertainty. I've talked to a number of CEOs over the last few weeks, participated in some webinars, et cetera, and so forth. The buzzword is uncertainty. And this is evidenced, for instance, by what just happened in the last 5 days, which is, I think on Friday, the White House announced a new tariff on the EU, on Europe. I can't remember what the amount was, 50% maybe. And then the market reacted and market went down. And then over the weekend, there was a bunch of stuff. And then by Monday, it was announced that there was a meeting and there weren't going to be these tariffs. So that's kind of how things have gone over the last few months tariff-wise. It doesn't mean that those tariffs aren't going to happen and might not be at a high level. And I think the challenge for a lot of business leaders is, as they said in the first Trump term, do you take him literally or do you take him seriously? And now you kind of need to do both, because the fact is, at the moment, for instance, the tariffs on China are 30%. That's a very high tariff, particularly if you're a small business. So I'm not going to put economic uncertainty aside, but that's kind of overarching everything. Tariffs, as I just mentioned, it's been kind of a bumpy ride over the last few months since Liberation Day. We have experienced tariffs before. Tariffs aren't in and of themselves necessarily a bad thing. Targeted tariffs often make sense to protect certain industries, to address an uneven playing field with certain trade partners. So we shouldn't think of tariffs as a bad word necessarily. What seems to be happening now is kind of a broad stroke. I think people use meat cleaver or a term like that instead of targeted. Might this result in more targeted tariffs at some point? Maybe. We don't know. That would be a good thing, but it's up in the air. You, I'm sure, are aware that NAFTA, which is now called USMCA, has been in effect for a very long time, decades. That has, and the word isn't really protected, but that has helped smooth trade between the US and Canada and Mexico. And it's worked pretty successfully. I was very involved with a lot of the preparations for the renegotiation for the USMCA, which was in the first Trump term. I was literally on a call every week for a year and a half with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and National Association of Manufacturers. They were very involved in the negotiations. And by and large, people were pretty pleased by what happened, when a new trade deal was announced. And President Trump was also pleased with that at that time. Since then, I would say things have become a little more challenging in the last few months. Canada is our biggest trading partner. Canada, Mexico, and China are our 3 biggest trading partner countries. And once you start poking around at those relationships, it becomes a bit challenging, particularly with Canada. I'm pretty close to the Canada consulate, which is located in Boston. And the consul general is a woman named Bernadette Jordan. She's energetic, and she used to be the fisheries minister in Canada. She's from Atlantic Canada, as most of the consul generals for Canada end up being, because that's the closest geographic area in Canada to our area of New England. And she's been pretty fired up about all this. I don't blame her. What's been very interesting is hearing the conversations from the Canadians. The biggest deal, and this affected deal isn't the right word, but big deal, so to speak, that affected the outcome of the recent election where there's now a new prime minister in Canada, Mr. Carney, the way people voted somewhat unexpectedly as of 3 months ago, but not so much surprisingly as of today, was that the biggest concern of the Canadians was the threat to their sovereignty. They're not happy about the tariffs, there are issues, but the notion that the US seemed to be insulting their sovereignty, was very concerning. And the ties with Canada go far beyond the economic ties. They're strong cultural ties as well. We're close geographically, and there's a lot of joint history with Canada. One of the interesting outcomes, and good for Canada, from all this kerfluffle, is that they are very focused on strengthening trade relationships with the EU, for instance. They've been very dependent on the US for decades, and big trading partners. As they say, we should have done a better job diversifying a while ago. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So in addition to focusing on opportunities with Europe, they're also focused on tearing down trade barriers between the provinces. And the provinces in Canada are kind of like the states in the US, not exactly, but apparently there have been significant trade barriers. There's not been a whole lot of trade back and forth across the provinces, and they're working to change that. So to Canada's credit, as there's a lesson maybe there for all of us, yeah, something happens that's not a great thing for you. What can you do? You don't sit still, you can't sit still. What can we do? What can we act on? How can we better our circumstance? And that's a lot of what the Canadians are working on. Supply chain challenges. Supply chain has been a focus since the pandemic. Many of us probably never really thought about supply chains or knew what they were, and then they became, very much in the news during the pandemic. I mention this because some of what's going on, and some of this started during the pandemic, then it waned, and now kind of it's back again. Companies faced with these significant tariffs are looking at ways they can better their circumstance, and that might be making adjustments to their supply chain. You get your inputs or a part from China, well, that's now taxed or tariffed at a much higher level. What can you do? Can you find a domestic manufacturer? Can you change how you make your product? Now, you can't do that with all products, but maybe you can. Maybe making an adjustment will enable you to get that part or that input elsewhere at a cheaper price. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. It takes not weeks, not even months. It generally takes years, but it's not a bad effort to undertake, again, to mitigate your risk, to spread it out over a kind of a wider thing. So some of that is indeed going on. Again, this doesn't change overnight, but that's what's happening. Small businesses are the ones that are really struggling and going to struggle with what's going on. If you're a big company, if you're Walmart or Target or one of those, you can better absorb some price increases that you're going to have to take for goods that are coming, for instance, from China or Vietnam or elsewhere. If you're a small business, that's much harder to do. I was talking with a woman who runs her own dress company, higher end dresses out of New York. She's got about 50 employees. And she does she and her team do the cutting, the design, the cutting, the sewing, the finishing, all here. They don't get their fabrics from here. We don't make that fine fabric in the United States. They get it from Italy, they get it from France, they get it from Japan, etc. She can't just change that on a dime. She was telling me, I saw her in April, she said she's canceled a number of purchase orders because she couldn't take the chance on something coming from China at 145% tariff. She said, but I already had goods on the water. So I've somehow got to come up with $150,000 to get them once in duties on top of the worth of the fabric. And she said, these are sort of killers for small business. She had an op-ed in Women's Wear Daily about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which I'm happy to share. I can certainly send it to Sid, and then it can go out to you. So that's an example of a small business truly struggling. It's not yet existential, but it could be. Does she want to do more stuff in the US? Absolutely. She believes in this, but it's hard to do given the circumstances. I was talking about a month ago to a guy I know who owns and runs a winery in California, Frog's Leap. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but and he was saying, you know, there's been some talk about, oh, isn't this great, kind of this protectionism thing, we're taking care of the US first. He said, the fact that I can no longer sell my wine into Canada, because Canada was a big distribution opportunity for him. He said, I'm losing $250,000 a year of business because that business is gone. Canada no longer has any US-made liquor, wine, spirits on any shelf in any store in Canada. That is done. Now, is it done forever? We hope not. But that's another example of it's pretty draconian, but the Canadians reacted pretty quickly to say, that's not going to work. A couple of other areas that will affect particularly Massachusetts. One is tourism, and you've probably heard and read about this. The Canadian tourism is a significant part of the economy of New England, so it's not just Massachusetts, especially Maine. And already, Canadians are not booking flights, they're not planning trips, they're not renting hotel rooms, et cetera. So that will have a significant impact, economic impact. We'll know more as the summer progresses. There's been a lot of talk about we'll know more in the third and fourth quarters of what the overall economic impact is going to be with what's going on. Interestingly, I was on a webinar about a month and a half ago, and one of the speakers was a guy who owns and runs this company called Luke's Lobster. I think it's kind of a big, I'm not really familiar with them, but he's a youngish guy. I'm guessing he's probably mid-30s, could be 40. And he was sharing that right now it's okay, but he's concerned because he's kind of covered by the NAFTA USMCA, so they're not really struggling yet. But he said there's a perception problem where if we're in an economic downturn, you're probably not going to buy a lobster roll because it seems like a luxury item. It's not like buying milk or bread, or eggs, which you're probably going to buy anyway. You're not going to invest, so to speak, in a lobster sandwich. So he's concerned. However, he's optimistic, and I'll talk about that in a little while. He's pretty positive about what might be coming. Another area specific to Massachusetts, and I was mentioning this earlier, is foreign students, international students. And we don't know yet how that's going to play out. But from what I've been reading and studying, a lot of the colleges and universities in Massachusetts have a number of foreign students. Foreign students tend to be full pay. They are not eligible for financial aid. And so they're a big economic driver for a lot of colleges and universities. So when you look at your area, UMass is one of them. One of the colleges that has a significant international student population. In the Boston area, Boston University and Northeastern University are two of the largest enrollers of foreign students in the whole United States. So and maybe it's because we're New England and we have a lot of colleges and universities and so on and so forth. But and it's not just paying the tuition. It's foreign students whose families come to visit, stay in a hotel, do the tourism thing, eat in restaurants. There's a lot that circles around the international student population. Again, the jury's still out on this. We don't know what's going to happen. It may yet be the case where all foreign students will not be expelled from Massachusetts. We don't know. But that would have a significant impact on Massachusetts, more than a lot of other places in the US. There's also immigration, and I'm not going to talk a lot about immigration, but it needs to be mentioned because immigration has been a big source of labor for the workforce in Massachusetts. Legal immigration and illegal immigration, or less legal, I don't know how you describe that. And this is a concern because there are companies that may have, both for legal immigrants and others, because there's so much attention right now on the sector that there's hesitancy for people to go to jobs, to show up at jobs, to et cetera. So we're not seeing a big impact on that yet directly, but that may yet be coming. And Massachusetts has been dependent on immigrants for the inflow of population over the last few years. We would have significantly lost population if it weren't for immigrants. So how that will play out, we don't know either. Again, I get back to uncertainty kind of being the key word. There's also been an effort by the Trump administration to target a number of sectors that are particularly strong in Massachusetts. So the environment, the energy sector, higher ed, pharma and medical, which is very strong in Massachusetts, wind energy, et cetera. So there's concern about higher ed, as I also mentioned. So how's that going to play out? We don't know. Some of this may be rhetoric. We hope that it is just rhetoric. Again, don't know how that's going to play out. So what's coming next? Oh, who knows what's coming next? None of us knows. If anybody knows, please volunteer and tell me what's coming next, because I'd like to know that. In Canada, Western Canada, I think it's Alberta, there's a meeting of the G7 being US, Canada, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and us. Did I leave somebody out? I don't remember. So there's a meeting in Western Canada in June of the G7. These meetings are very big deals. So the question is Trump going to go or is he not going to go? And I was on a webinar a few weeks ago. And it was funny that they were saying it could be a good thing if he goes, or it could be a challenging thing if he goes, because if he goes, all the attention is going to be on him and not on the rest of the discussion. On the other hand, it would be good if he goes because he's part of the conversation and, you know, as the leader of the US. So who knows what's going to come with that. That may or may not be meaningful. We'll see. The other thing that's happening a little bit longer term is that the USMCA, this is the trade pact we have with Mexico and Canada, is up for negotiation in 2026. That's actually very soon. Trade negotiations are complex and take a long time, a long, long time. It's unclear what will happen with this. Might we end up with separate agreements with Canada and Mexico? Maybe. As you may have read, the issue the issues from the White House are the fentanyl traffic into the U.S. and illegal immigration. Those are mostly issues, or were, not so much now in Mexico, certainly not in Canada. There's very little fentanyl that comes across the Canadian border. And the border crossing, illegal border crossings are way down in Mexico as well. You know, it seems that this president is looking at Canada and Mexico differently, so we will see how that plays out. Canada's working very hard to come to agreement on areas where they can come to agreement with the US. So we shall see. Canada has also assessed reciprocal tariffs on products that are specific to the US. Peanut butter, bourbon, wine, OJ. You know, I think you saw this during a little bit the first Trump term. Choosing areas that Canada knows are particularly sensitive for members of Congress who are from districts where these products are produced. So it heightens attention on that. Now, would they prefer not to do that? Of course. Canada, however, does have some things that the US needs and uses, one of which is lumber, one of which is rare earth minerals, and one of which is energy, particularly in New England. The energy source from Hydro-Quebec, for instance, is a very important source of energy in New England. There's also joint interests in defense, in military, that have been in existence for a long time. So the hope is that those will continue to be sustained as strong areas of cooperation and collaboration. Some fun facts about energy is apparently, I'm just looking at my notes here, 90% of the jet fuel at Logan Airport comes from Canada. 8 of 10 cars in Massachusetts are fueled by energy from Canada. And as you may or may not know, the auto supply chain, this is relevant both for Canada and for Mexico, is very strong and integrated between the two countries. Parts go across the border 6 or 7 times before an automobile model is finalized. So that's been described as sort of the perfect model for integration and supply chain. Whether that will change permanently or not, we don't know. So what have I not touched on? China. I am no China expert. I was in Shanghai about 6 or 7 years ago meeting with the U.S. Department of Commerce Commercial Service officer there, long-time what they call China hand. He'd been there for about 15 years. And he said, anybody who tells you they know China is not telling the truth because it's really complicated. Now, he's been there a long time, so he had some very good insights, but mentioned that. That being said, China is struggling in some ways as well, not just because of what the U.S. has done, but they've had overbuilding in the real estate sector, and they are also struggling because of the changes that have happened already from the Trump administration with trade. One of the things that's happened is when the tariffs were first announced, a lot of U.S. companies either, as I mentioned earlier, canceled purchase orders or stopped bringing as much in goods from China. So there are containers and container ships sitting empty in China, not coming. So a lot of companies will not have sufficient goods for the back-to-school season, Halloween, and particularly Christmas. You know, the timing of that, the orders typically come in the first 4 or 5 months of the year from U.S. companies, and then once the containers arrive, they go to a distribution center, and then they get trucked around the U.S. It's unclear what's going to happen with that. A lot of orders were canceled. Then when the tariffs were dropped from 145% to 30%, some companies said, oh, we want to start this up again. It doesn't start up on a dime. In the U.S., truck drivers and dock workers and trains had all been kind of a lot of them been put on hold. Well, can that start up again right away at a sufficient level? Unknown, but that is a factor. And I'm sure you've heard some of the quotes from the administration that they're confident that there will be sufficient goods for the holiday season. I think we don't know yet. That may very well be true, but we will have to wait and see. Okay, what have I missed? Oh, so I have another guy I know who's the CEO of a small manufacturing company in the Boston area. And he was saying that since January, he, as a lot of companies did, kind of advance ordered, that brought a lot of stuff in before the tariffs were going to take effect. And this is even before they knew what Trump was going to do. And he said, my board thought I was crazy. And they were not in favor of it, but I prevailed. And thank God I did it, because we got a lot of stuff in, some of it still in the warehouse. He said, then we also had a situation where I had some goods coming in, and the numbers were pretty compelling. He said, they ended up having to be shipped by air. It was $57,000 of goods, and I had to pay $78,000 in duties from China. And again, for a small business, those are really big numbers. He told me, he said, I had to lay off 6 or 7 people, which is really hard to do, especially in a small company. So this stuff is happening. So what is there to be optimistic about? Well, I'll give you the example from the Luke's Lobster guy. He knows there's storm clouds on the horizon, somewhat affected now. You may or may not know this, but most of the fish that we consume in the U.S. does not come from the U.S. It comes from overseas. And most of the lobsters in New England are sent to Canada for processing. A lot of that comes back, but they're not processed in New England because there are very few processing places left in New England. That industry has gone overseas. But this Luke says, it's a resilient industry. There have been issues for decades, challenges, and this industry and the lobstermen have prevailed. So I am optimistic that we will find a way through this. Innovation, I mentioned earlier, if you have a good and some of the inputs come from China, can you innovate? Can you change how you do it? Can you make modifications to make you less vulnerable to what's going on with the supply chain issues? We live in an area that's pretty innovative, and so building on that may be a good thing. Creativity, same idea. Coming up with new ways of looking at your product, changing your product, modifying it, making it work, and working with your customers in the same way. And a lot of this is reflective of what happened during COVID. I can remember getting panicked calls from companies, what am I going to do? One of the things, and this is still relevant today, that can be done, it's a little more challenging because of the part of the world we're from, and we're a blue state rather than a red state or even a purple state, is make sure your elected officials know what's going on, what your concerns are. Because these people have the ear of people in Washington, and if jobs are involved, and of course we all in our districts have companies that have jobs, that's a pretty compelling thing to talk about, is the job situation. So when I was counseling companies during COVID, you had to get creative about this. Okay, so you need to make the appeal, for instance, to get an exemption from a particular tariff or particular situation. All right, so you have the disadvantage that you're coming from Massachusetts. That being said, do you have clients or customers in other states, maybe red states? Okay, that's a possible way in. Do you have operations in another state or a sister operation that you could talk about? Again, kind of positioning yourself better when it comes to the possibility of getting exemptions. The exemption thing right now is a little bit up in the air. It seems like some companies are getting it, not all, some industries. Supposedly there were going to be no exemptions, but I think there are some exemptions. So stay tuned. We don't know about that yet. And being resourceful is another reason for optimism. We're New Englanders. We can be resourceful. We're good at that. So what can you do? Just a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned earlier, follow the news, keep up with what's going on, stay on it, listen to neighbors, people you know who work in companies, who run companies, who own companies. Listen to their concerns and speak to your officials, local officials, national officials. Make sure it's well known. Sometimes it's easier to hear not directly from the company, but from somebody who knows the company or is involved with the company or is a neighbor of somebody who works at a company. So make your voice heard and particularly focus on the job component, because that is important. We need to keep jobs. We need to grow jobs. Workforce is a big thing in Massachusetts. So that's about it for my observations. Again, I don't have answers. There's a lot of uncertainty, don't know what's going to happen, but you can't sit still. And we learned this during COVID. I was so impressed by the number of companies who were faced with this challenge, that challenge, or the other challenge. The worst thing you can do is sit still and wring your hands like, oh, it's just a terrible situation. And it was a terrible situation, but companies just got at it, got on it. Tried this approach, tried a different approach. I worked with a plastics company that found that it was helpful working through their trade association. So they needed a component that they couldn't get, but somebody in the trade association knew a company that had it. So, sourcing from different places. Again, there's ways of being resourceful, and you need to not sit still. You need to do your outreach, interact, talk to whatever your business association, your industry association, and your elected officials. And we'll see where this goes. I'm an optimist. I'm a keep the faith kind of person. So I'm hopeful that we'll come out of this in a pretty decent place. I don't know. but I like to look at the optimistic side of things, so we shall see. So that's my talk. Thank you.
Hi, Kristen. So I read the Boston Globe's emails every day, and I open a lot of them up and save them to read later. And unfortunately, sometimes I get busy, and by the end of the week, I have 20 browser tabs open, and my computer starts to slow down, and eventually I get.
But probably that Monday news wasn't relevant by
Exactly.
Friday, so
Exactly.
you're fine on
so
that.
half
Yeah.
of them get closed anyway.
Yeah.
And so I'm a little embarrassed to say I have not read it yet, but sometime in the last couple of days, the Globe has had an article that basically headlines, "Why is Trump picking on Harvard?" He seems to be going after Harvard, whether it's because he perceives them as a woke, elitist Ivy or whatever. Basically saying, why is Trump picking on Harvard? Why is Trump picking on Massachusetts? Is that true? Do you have any thoughts to that?
I think there's a certain element of personal, as there often is with Trump. And from what I understand, I don't know this for fact, but it may be real estate related with the Pritzker family, because Penny Pritzker is the chair of the board at Harvard. In the same way that apparently, Columbia University in New York City had some early issues with the Trump administration, which I think are still going on. And it went back to some slight, 30 years ago with Trump and maybe Trump's father about some slice of land somewhere that Columbia had that they want. I don't even know the details. I mean, it's like, this is the crazy stuff. I will say, I was on a Goldman Sachs webinar about 3 weeks ago. And one of the things that was said was, it's going to be interesting to see who prevails in the White House, in the administration. Will it be the more moderate, which would be Besant Greer, who's the U.S. Trade Representative, and there was a third name I can't remember, which is longer term, sensible financial policy. They're smart, they're savvy, they get this. Or will it be Lutnick, who's the Commerce Secretary, and some of the others? And the prevailing thought, I don't know, I mean, this was at this moment at Goldman Sachs, who knows, was ultimately the sensible will prevail. But in the meantime, we're going to see this less sensible thing happen. So
I know he doesn't like the Pritzkers. President Trump doesn't like the Pritzkers.
yeah, and again, I think this goes back to some real estate deals. So it's very personal instead of, this is what I was talking about earlier. It's targeted tariffs, okay. Blanket tariffs, probably not sensible. So I think this is a style thing, and you throw the bomb and then you mop up after it. So we will see.
I wanted to build on your comments about higher education, not just the colleges, but also the private schools. I have a son who has a small business getting kids into colleges and prep schools. He's had multiple clients who told him, no, you did a lot for us, but we're not coming. Reputation has really been tarnished. He has a friend who feeds him a lot of business, has a very large company like this in China, has had one client in the last 3 months.
Wow.
So people look upon us they don't want to come. Not only, they're not sure they're going to get in.
Or get out.
Or they're
not gonna get out
but
to
they
where
might
they-
not get back in.
Yeah.
And this is a reputational thing that you cannot fix with widgets.
Well, that's a very valid point, and it's when the damage is done, it takes a long time to recover. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing, that a lot of things are being eroded. They're not going to come back right away with a different administration, or it's going to take a while. So it's significant damage. I will say I have a friend who teaches a graduate course in communications, I think, at Boston University. He's been teaching there for 4 or 5 years. And he was told, we don't think there's going to be a course for you to teach next year because most of his students are foreign students and they're probably not going to come. And they said that might change, but for now you need to know that, assume you're not going to have a job next year. My husband teaches infrastructure finance and on a graduate level, at the college level. And I would say 2/3 of his students are international. He had a good semester this semester, but what will happen next year? I think it's very unknown. I do know that a number of colleges and universities increased the number of students they accepted in this round with the knowledge or the estimate that their yields were going to go down because international students would probably choose, a number of them would choose not to come. I did see, to your point about Harvard, in one of the media reports the other day, that the Canada Prime Minister's daughter is a student at Harvard, so she would have to leave. And some European, like, royalty person, yeah, that's what, okay, is a student, so she would have to leave. And this is only, these little anecdotes, you can be sure there are a lot of people in that situation. Logistically, I'm not sure how that would happen or what, in targeting one particular university. But don't think it's not going to, I think there's a personal thing about Harvard, but don't think this isn't going to spill over to other colleges and universities. It is. It's not going to be just Harvard. And, as for targeting Massachusetts, I think it's the woke liberal, that sort of thing. Again, we're not the only state that looks like that. And I unfortunately, it just seems that there's a certain amount of powerlessness among the in Congress, in the opposing party. So I think that will continue to be a challenge. Yes.
I think the psychological damage that living with this indecision is causing is a factor that is really prevailing these days, and that is something we have to know how to handle.
I think that's a valid point. And I touched on that a little bit. It's the perception versus the reality, or what's coming, or what might come, or whatever. One thing I forgot to mention, I do some work with Massport. And I don't know how many of you saw this story, but there is a proposal to put a huge tax on any container ship that comes into a U.S. port and that the ship wasn't built in the U.S. Now, we've been out of the shipbuilding business, except for military, for a long time. China owns that business in the same way that China owns a lot of stuff related to ports around the world. So the reality is, for Massport, for the Port of Boston, that's an existential threat. They would go away because the container ships would stop calling in Boston if the tax were that high. Now, there's been a major effort by a lot of industry associations and companies writing and saying, no, this makes no sense. And the reality is, even if you wanted to restart a shipbuilding industry for container ships, that would take a very long time. Be unclear who would be trained. You got to train people. It's just not practical. Same thing with a lot of other, bringing more manufacturing back to the U.S. Some of that will happen, but it'll be on the margin because it takes a long time to build a manufacturing plant. I heard a story the other day about a Midwestern company that built a new factory building, I think it was in Michigan, and because they wanted to bring more work back to the U.S. They need the high-end machines, and the machines come from Japan. And at this point, the cost with the tariffs is so significant that they're not bringing in the machines, so they've got a building that's empty. So I think there are stories like this. We'll see. Did we have one more question? Did you have a question?
My question has to do with the tariffs that were recently levied on Europe, and they kind of caught me off guard in a way, and they were very high. And it was mentioned that the administration's feeling was that we had been treated unfairly for a long time by Europe, which I had not realized. Could you speak to that? How had they been unfair to us?
Well, I'm not sure that, this is a position that the White House takes, that everybody's been unfair to the U.S., so it's not specific to a particular country. I do think there's something to be, in fact, Europe is kind of Europe taken as a whole is the biggest trading partner of the U.S. and has been for a very long time because it's, 47 countries or something? It's a lot of countries. One of the challenges is all those countries do their own thing. No, it's 27 countries? I should have that number off the top of my head. And so it is hard to get consensus. That being said, there are certainly areas where there's a particular product or a rub on something, but not generally. There's a perhaps unrealistic focus from the White House on trade deficits. That's why I mentioned services at the start of the talk, because services really ought to be part of the discussion, but they're not. So I would not believe that there has been unfairness in a major way for years with a number of. It's interesting. I heard a gentleman from a German business association in Washington speak about a month and a half ago. He was a lot less concerned about the situation because Germany and German companies have made a lot of investment in the U.S. And obviously that's a good thing for the U.S., however you look at it. So he said, we're a little bit less concerned because we're dealing from a position of strength. He said, bringing in new investment is going to be a little bit of a challenge, so that may not be happening. But he was more of a status quo person than some of the other people representing countries that I've heard from. I think my time is up. She's like, oh.
Hey, one more question. So Trump 45, America first.
Uh-huh.
A lot of protectionism put in place. Biden came in, kept a lot of the same, and now Trump 47 is accelerating that. How will the global trading system work? Or what do you foresee with the trades? Because with all this, you're breaking up. The U.S. is in a dominant position no matter what a lot of people need the U.S., and that's why he's playing that card. But at the end of the day, what's the future global world trade order look like from your years in the business?
Yeah, I'm no expert. I was just reading a piece in the Wall Street Journal about this, and it's broken, and it's going to be broken maybe forever. Now, what does broken mean? Maybe a variety of things. The global order has been upset, and that's going to continue with this administration. Will there be opportunities, perhaps, for some industries or some companies? Probably. Will there be disruption? Absolutely, it's already happening. So I think we're moving away from an era of more peaceful or frictionless trade. And whether you believe in fair trade, free trade, however you look at it, certainly frictionless trade is a better thing for everyone. New alliances are forming. There's a big focus in the Middle East. How will that play out? Don't know. But I don't see us really returning to the way things were for a long time, if ever. Even with assuming something happens with the midterms or the next president, I think once these things are broken, they don't easily come back. But there may be some new good things, some new alignments, work with allies, et cetera, that are positive. So we'll see.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
We have a little gift for you.
Oh,
My Hijacking, A Personal History of Forgetting and Remembering by Martha Hodes, who was our
heard of this
annual meeting speaker.
I've heard of her.
So thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. I enjoyed being with you today. So, and I'll send some stuff to Sid, and you can share it with the group if you want.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, thanks.